wanted to talk a little bit about the origin of judo and the relationship between judo and jiu-jitsu. My name is Deidre Hamaguchi. I'm a second-degree black belt in judo, and I was a U.S. national champion in the late 90s at 45 kilos. So I've devoted a lot of my life to the pursuit of judo and the study of judo. Well, as you know, judo was founded by a man named Jigorokano in 1882 in Japan. And Jigorokano was a student of jiu-jitsu. Now, I need you to forget everything you know about judo and jiu-jitsu and what you've seen in your social media feeds, and imagine it's back 1880s, early 1900s in Japan to understand the historical context of jiu-jitsu at that time. Historically, jiu-jitsu was armed and unarmed hand-to-hand combat for the battlefield. So it was an art that was intended for study by military men. I've heard a few people mention samurai and all of this, and it's really probably not so romantic because, I mean, war is ugly, and the Japanese government at the time could conscript men to force them to fight in the army. So there's nothing really romantic about that. But on the battlefield at that time, jiu-jitsu was needed because if a soldier lost his horse, lost his sword, lost his dagger, is now unarmed on the ground, he still has to contend with an enemy who might still be armed with a sword or a dagger. So the jiu-jitsu repertoire does include weapons and striking. Although the striking, bear in mind, these soldiers are wearing very heavy body armor, so the strikes are not flashy. There's no spinning back movement, jumping, leaping kicks or strikes. They're very slow and deliberate strikes. But it was necessary for a soldier at that time to know how to disarm somebody, control them, use leverage, use joint manipulation, either finish them standing up or throw them on the ground and finish them on the ground. So that was the context for jiu-jitsu. It wasn't, a sport yet. It wasn't recreational at this point. It was serious business. Now, Kano felt that jiu-jitsu training was really, really valuable in terms of character development. But he also knew that with the advent of firearms, this type of hand-to-hand combat training may become obsolete for military purposes. So he wanted to bring that valuable training into the modern era. And his solution was twofold. One, to bring a martial art into physical education, something that children could practice, women could practice to keep themselves healthy and fit. And the second solution was he wanted to bring a martial art into the Olympic Games. And really a brilliant solution because those two ideas work hand in hand. When you have a general population that practices a martial art or a sport, you have a huge base to sort of build and draw upon students of that sport or martial art that decide they want to commit themselves to becoming an Olympian. That gives a huge motivation for young people to kind of keep them engaged in a sport. If they know they have an opportunity to make it to an Olympic Games, I think that's what keeps a lot of young folks engaged in their sport or martial art. In order for Kano to do that, he had to make this martial art, jiu-jitsu, safe for children and for a sport competition. So what he did was he removed all the permanently damaging joint manipulations. So in judo, submissions were only allowed to do a straight armbar because the elbow is the fastest healing joint in the human body. We're not allowed to do any joint manipulation from hips, knees, ankles, feet, and of course no fingers and not the shoulder. And as far as the chokes are concerned, in judo, we are not permitted to put any pressure on the neck. So for example, you can't do a guillotine choke in judo. But you can of course choke with a gi, and you can in fact choke with no gi if you choose to. So the modern Olympic sport of judo does not include any of those submissions. However, the original old school judo did include leg locks, heel hooks, etc. There's two pieces of evidence for this, and one is a book by Moshe Feldenkrais called Higher Judo, Groundwork. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it for jiu-jitsu and judo practitioners alike. There are some terrific illustrations in the book, and they show leg locks and heel hooks, both from standing and ground. So I think that's definitely evidence that the judo repertoire at that era, that time, before it became an Olympic sport, included the leg locks. That book was published in 1952, and Feldenkrais was a student of one of the original students that was with Kano. So he's just one degree removed from Kano, and he taught a lot of jiu-jitsu and judo in France. He was also involved with the Israeli Defense Force. He was also a nuclear physicist with CERN, and he developed his Feldenkrais method, which I understand led to something you may have heard of called the Alexander technique. I think both practices are ways for people to heal themselves through movement. Fascinating human being, Mr. Feldenkrais, so he's worth looking into. Now, the second piece of evidence that old school judo contained the leg locks and more of the submissions that we know and associate with jiu-jitsu is something that still exists right now called Kosen judo. And it's a different type of judo, if you will, because I'm not sure if they're allowed to do heel hooks, but they're also allowed to, judoka and Kosen judo are allowed to throw guard just as jiu-jitsu folks are. So there's two pieces of very strong evidence that at one point judo and jiu-jitsu were very much almost one and the same. Very difficult to tell them apart. But let's jump forward to when judo became an Olympic sport in 1964 at the Tokyo Olympic Games. Now, it had actually been approved for the Olympic Games by the International Olympic Committee in the late 30s or early 30s, I'm not sure. But unfortunately, Jigorokano passed away in 1938, so he didn't live long enough to see his dream come to fruition with judo in the 1964 Olympic Games. Of course, that World War II interrupted everything, so things got postponed. But thanks to his huge vision, you know, judo was made an Olympic sport and has been since '64. For men, women's events were added as an exhibition sport in the Seoul Korea Games in 1988, and women's events have been included ever since. So let's take a look at the judo rules. So one key point, I think, one distinction between judo and jiu-jitsu is that in judo we really emphasize the throws. I know that in some, modern day jiu-jitsu schools, they don't really teach any of the throws, any of the judo throws. They do wrestling, takedowns, like single, double, are the bulk of what's shown. Now, in my opinion, really, from the context of things, jiu-jitsu and judo is supposed to be a subset of jiu-jitsu because jigorokano removed the dangerous aspects of jiu-jitsu to form judo. So really it behooves a jiu-jitsu student to learn some judo throws. That's just my opinion. But by judo rules, we can win the match immediately with a perfect throw. So now I've heard Jocko Willink say, well, that limits the judoka because they get the throw and then they stop. And I would say, no, Jocko, you got it wrong, because we can win with a perfect throw, we work so hard on those throws. I mean, they tell you when you start judo, you got repetitions called uchikomi. You've got to do 10,000 uchikomi of that throw, and then you can say you're starting to learn that throw. And there's a lot of truth in that, because you do have to put the motion of the throw in your body, and then you have to try to execute the throw on your sparring partner in live sparring. And that's the way you learn the throw, is through the sparring. You get your timing down, you get your rhythm down, you get your setup down, etc. So yeah, as judoka, we have to spend so much time drilling ad infinitum those throws. And the other side of that is, of course, no one's gonna let you just throw them. You gotta be the person taking falls for your training partners too. So it's a reciprocal process, and it's also probably the biggest reason why it's really great if you can learn judo when you're a kid, because it's a lot easier to take falls when you're smaller and more rubbery and can just bounce off the mat and keep going. I think it's a little tougher to learn judo throws as an adult. It's, I wouldn't say easier, but it's a little less taxing on the body to stick with ground fighting as an adult. In any case, there are jiu-jitsu practitioners who did or do embrace judo training. And I'm going to refer specifically to the Gracie family simply because there's so much footage of them historically, available on YouTube and whatnot, so I'm able to find that evidence. So for example, there's footage of Hollis Gracie doing a sparring session with Hickson and I think one other sparring partner, and I can tell immediately just by watching that footage that Hollis Gracie for sure trained with legit competitive judoka at a high level, because not only because of how he moves around the mat with both Hickson and this other partner, but his choice of throws. They're not by someone who's just sort of dabbling in judo and practiced a little bit. They're competitive judo moves. So for example, in his session with Hickson, right off the bat he gets a foot sweep and throws Hickson. In the middle of their session, he does, I think, a kochi to a drop, what we call, so a little foot movement to set up a bigger throw where he drops down right on his shins right in front of Hickson in an attempt to throw Hickson over his head and onto the mat. Now that attempt doesn't work, but the fact that Hollis would even choose to try that shows me he's worked with competitive judoka. And then finally, towards the end of the session, Hollis is gripping Hickson in a right-handed grip. So his right hand's on the lapel, left hand's on the sleeve. That's sort of classic right-handed grip. But what he does is he shoots for what I call a reaching left osoto. So it's, that again is also that's not something you learn as just sort of a recreational judoka. That is a good, what we would call, I guess, a switch move, right? Because you're setting him up, you're taking a right-handed grip, right-handed stance, but you're going in for a left-handed throw, and Hollis gets that throw. He's able to throw Hickson with that. So Hollis Gracie definitely worked with competitive judoka. Now, Roger Gracie, in an interview, said that he trained at the Budokwai in London. And the Budokwai in London is a sort of mecca for judo competitors in England. It's not for the faint of heart. If you're gonna train there, it's gonna be very hard training. So just to have but it takes the mental fortitude to get on the mat at the Bagaimanakah. I have to give props to Roger Gracie for doing that. And then thirdly, Cómo Gracie, who's still competing, he trained at Tenri Dojo in Los Angeles in Boyle Heights. Now, this was just before he was making his MMA debut in Japan. I actually had the privilege of working with him a couple of times, and his stand-up randori, stand-up sparring for judo was fine. He was very smooth, he was not stiff, he moved well, he threw me, I threw him, but he didn't, he flowed well as a judoka. He had really good movement, and that's I think that's huge, because if you're already, he just won ADCC, so he's already, a world champion in jiu-jitsu. But for him to come and train at a judo school that's also known to be a pretty tough dojo, where a lot of competitors show up randomly, that takes a lot of mental toughness to say, put aside my accomplishments in jiu-jitsu, and I'm just going to get on the mat and I'm just going to try to do judo as best as I can without pulling any of my quote-unquote jiu-jitsu moves in order to quote-unquote win in practice. So, I mean, huge props to him for doing that, and huge props to the Gracie legacy and family, because I don't think those three examples I just gave you happened quote-unquote just randomly by accident. Somewhere, I don't know if it was the patriarch Helio Carlos or their father who said, if you want to learn some judo, you need to go work with judo guys in a judo school. And that's absolutely true. It's maybe a more tougher way to learn, but it is probably the most effective. So to sum up, my point is that judo and jiu-jitsu, originally they were almost one and the same. And as part of Jigorokano's vision to sort of have this very valuable martial art training disseminate globally, he decided to create a quote-unquote safer martial art that could be done as phys ed and as an Olympic sport. And in my opinion, I think he was a genius for figuring that out, because he succeeded. We have world champions from all over the globe. That means judo has been spread successfully. It's a unified martial art, meaning I could get on a plane, fly anywhere in the world, not speak the language wherever I land, go to a dojo, I can bow, get on the mat, and I can feel comfortable, because even though I don't speak the verbal language, we all speak judo language, and it's the same. The osotogari here is the same as it is in any dojo anywhere on planet Earth. An ogoshi here, same thing anywhere on planet Earth. And we use those Japanese terminology for the throw, so we all know what we're talking about, right? I don't use major outer reaping throw for osotogari. I just say osotogari, and anybody who does judo knows what I'm talking about. So that's one aspect of judo that I truly appreciate, is that it is truly unified and truly global. I think, of course, there's right now jiu-jitsu is more sort of prolific in North America, and there's huge value, of course, in jiu-jitsu training as well. But I just wanted to share with you a few ideas about the historical relationship between judo and jiu-jitsu. So if you like this video, please share it with your friends. Please comment below if you have any thoughts or ideas, or even if you disagree. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.